tent had been slashed from the inside. 9 sets of footprints led away into the darkness, some barefoot, others in only socks, moving down slope through snow that fell thick and fast beneath a moonless Ural sky. The year was 1959. The month was February. The temperature was 30 degrees below zero, and somewhere in that vast white silence, the expedition had begun to die. Inside the tent, which sagged now beneath fresh snow on the mountain's shoulder, tea sat unfinished in metal cups. Boots remained neatly arranged. Clothing lay folded. Maps and journals rested where they had been placed. Everything spoke of order, of routine interrupted not by struggle, but by sudden absolute terror. The slashes were clean, purposeful, made by hands that needed to escape faster than the entrance would allow. The footprints descended toward the tree line. Some were made by feet that pressed deep into the snow with full weight. Others showed the sliding, stumbling gait of those already losing coordination to the cold. The wind had begun to erase them even as they were made. And by dawn, when no one returned, the mountain would keep its secret beneath fresh drifts. The expedition leader's name was Igor Dyatlov. He was 23 years old, a fifth-year student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute experienced in winter routes, trusted by his companions. He had filed his route plan with the university's sports club. They would cross the northern Urals. They would reach Mount Otorten. They would return by the 12th of February. The route was graded Category 3, the second highest difficulty classification in Soviet mountaineering. It was not impossible, it was not meant to be fatal, and yet the mountain where they pitched their final camp would come to bear Dyatlov's name, though he would never descend from it alive. The place would be marked on no map for decades. Its coordinates would become synonymous with mystery, with theories that multiplied in the absence of answers. But on that night, as the 9 walked away from their slashed shelter into the killing cold, there were no theories. There was only wind and snow, and the terrible arithmetic of hypothermia. The last photograph in their cameras showed them digging into the snowpack to secure the tent. They were smiling. Chapter 1. The Gathering. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small around you. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour the clock shows where you rest, let us drift backward together through time. Let the present fade. Let history speak in whispers. And if you find value in these journeys into shadow and truth, subscribe so that we may meet again in darker corners of the past. Now, settle into stillness. Close your eyes if you wish. We return to the winter of 1959, to a country vast and cold, to a group of young people who believed the mountains could be conquered through preparation and will. The idea for the expedition began in the autumn of 1958, in the city of Sverdlovsk, which sat in the Ural Mountains like an industrial heart pumping steel and ambition through the veins of the Soviet Union. The city had been renamed from Yekaterinburg after the revolution, and its Polytechnic Institute trained engineers and geologists and technicians who would build dams and factories across Siberia. Among the students at the Ural Polytechnic Institute was a young man named Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov, 23 years old, a fifth-year student in the radio engineering department and an experienced hiker who had logged more winter expeditions than most men twice his age. Dyatlov was not tall, but he moved with efficiency. He spoke little but planned meticulously. His notebooks contained route calculations, equipment lists, caloric requirements, contingency maps. He had led expeditions before. He understood the northern Urals, their weather systems, their frozen rivers, the way the wind could turn a passable ridge into a killing ground within an hour. He respected the wilderness, and this respect manifested not as fear but as preparation. When he proposed a winter trek to Mount Otorten, a peak whose name in the Mansi language meant "do not go there," he did so with full knowledge of the route's difficulty and full confidence in his ability to lead a capable group through it. The expedition was to be graded Category 3, the second highest difficulty classification in the Soviet system of mountaineering and hiking. Category 3 demanded winter experience, navigation skill, physical endurance, and the ability to function as a cohesive unit under conditions that could deteriorate without warning. It was not recreational, it was not tourism, it was proof of competence, a test that, if passed, would earn each participant certification and recognition within the sports federations that govern such pursuits in the Soviet Union. For students at a polytechnic institute, where physical culture and collective achievement were encouraged alongside technical education, such expeditions represented both personal challenge and social duty. Dyatlov began assembling his team in December. He selected carefully. Each member had to possess winter camping experience, skiing ability, and the temperament to endure weeks in isolation without friction. The first he chose was Zinaida Alexeyevna Kolmogorova, 22 years old, a fourth-year student into radio engineering, known to friends as Zina. She was small and dark-haired and had camped in the Urals multiple times. She sang folk songs around campfires. She kept a diary in neat script. She was steady. Next came Lyudmila Alexandrovna Dubinina, also 22, an economics student with a sharp wit and a willingness to carry heavy loads. She had hiked the Caucasus. She was not afraid of cold. She wrote poetry in her spare time and had recently been disappointed in love, but she spoke of the expedition as an opportunity for renewal, for distance from heartache. Alexander Sergeyevich Kolovatov, 24, studying meteorology, quiet and methodical, joined next. He had served in the Soviet army and brought military discipline to logistics. He understood weather patterns. He could read the sky. Rustam Vladimirovich Slobodin, 23, another radio engineering student, had climbed in the Ural Mountains and survived a previous winter expedition during which the group had nearly starved. He knew hunger. He knew survival. He was resilient. Yuri Nikolaevich Doroshenko, 21, and Georgy Alexeyevich Krivonischenko, 23, both graduated students now working in Soviet industry, were experienced winter campers who had accompanied Dyatlov before. Doroshenko was a geologist. Krivonischenko worked at a nuclear facility in the closed city of Chelyabinsk 40, though he did not speak of his work in detail. Both were strong skiers. Both were loyal friends. Nikolai Vladimirovich Thibaut Brignol, 24, an engineering student with French ancestry traceable in his surname, had built his own equipment and tested it in the field. He was inventive and uncomplaining. Semyon Alexandrovich Zolotaryov was the eldest and the last to join. He was 37 years old, veteran of the Second World War, a man who walked with a slight limp from an old wound and who carried a camera everywhere. He had approached Dyatlov only weeks before departure, asking to join. His experience was extensive. His references were solid. Dyatlov accepted him. The 10th member was Yuri Yefimovich Yudin, a 21-year-old geology student and a close friend of Dyatlov. He packed his rucksack with the same care as the others, checked his skis, prepared his rations. On the 23rd of January 1959, the group assembled at Sverdlovsk railway station. They wore padded jackets and wool trousers and fur hats with ear flaps. They carried rucksacks weighing between 30 and 40 kilograms each, packed with tents, sleeping bags, food supplies calculated for 16 days, spare clothing, tools, cameras, journals, a mandolin, a guitar. The weight was distributed, the skis were strapped, the route plan had been filed with the Institute's sports club. They were expected to return by the 12th of February and to send a telegram upon arrival back in Vizhay, the last village on the route's northern edge. The train departed in the afternoon. It travelled northeast through snow-covered forests and across frozen rivers, through villages where smoke rose from chimneys into grey skies, through regions where the population thinned and the land grew harsher. The students sang songs, they played cards, they discussed literature and physics and the routes they had taken in previous years. There was laughter, there was camaraderie. They were young and strong and confident in their preparation. On the 25th of January, they reached the town of Ivdel, a logging settlement deep in the northern Urals where the rail line ended. From Ivdel they transferred to a truck that would carry them another 50 kilometers north to Vizhay, the final outpost before wilderness. The truck rode roughly over frozen logging roads. Snow lay thick on either side. The forest pressed close, pine and fir and birch, their branches heavy with frost. Vizhay was small. It consisted of wooden houses and a general store and a few administrative buildings that served the logging operations in the region. The group spent the night of the 27th in a dormitory provided by the local forestry office. They sorted their equipment. They repacked items for better weight distribution. Yudin, who had been suffering from sciatica and worsening leg pain throughout the journey, made the difficult decision to withdraw from the expedition. He could not risk injury in terrain where evacuation would be impossible. Dyatlov accepted the decision without argument. The group would continue as 9. On the morning of the 28th of January, they said farewell to Yudin. He stood in the snow and watched them depart on skis, pulling their sledges behind them, moving in single file into the forest. He waved. They waved back. He returned to Vizhay. He would be the last person to see them alive. The route from Vizhay led north and east, following the valley of the Lozva River. The terrain was taiga, dense coniferous forest broken by frozen streams and the occasional clearing. The temperature hovered near 20 degrees below 0 Celsius. The snow was deep. Travel was slow. They moved approximately 15 to 20 kilometers per day, stopping to make camp before darkness, pitching their tent, lighting a fire if conditions allowed, eating meals cooked over portable stoves or open flame. They took photographs. They wrote in their journals. Dubnina recorded her thoughts on the beauty of the forest. Kolmogorova described the effort of breaking trail. Dyatlov noted weather conditions and distances covered. On the 31st of January, they reached an abandoned geologist's camp near the source of the Ospaya River. They rested there. They stored excess supplies, food and equipment they would not need for the final push, in a wooden hut, planning to retrieve them on the return journey. This cache reduced their load. It was standard practice. The next stage would require mobility and speed. They would climb out of the forested valley onto the highland plateau, traverse the ridge, reach Mount Otorten, and descend back to the cache within 5 or 6 days. On the 1st of February, they broke camp early. The sky was overcast. The wind had risen during the night. They ascended through thinning forest onto the open slopes of the Ural Ridge. By afternoon, they were above the tree line, exposed to wind that carried snow in horizontal sheets. Visibility dropped. Navigation became difficult. Dyatlov consulted his map and compass. They should have turned east to follow the valley that led to Otorten. Instead, perhaps due to the whiteout conditions, they veered west onto the slope of a mountain the indigenous Mansi people called Kholat Shakal, Dead Mountain. Realizing the error, Dyatlov made a decision. Rather than descend back into the valley and lose altitude they had worked to gain, they would pitch camp on the slope and correct their route in the morning. It was not ideal. The wind was stronger on the exposed slope. The snow was harder to dig into, but they were experienced. They had camped in worse. They found a relatively flat area on the mountainside at an elevation of approximately 900 meters. They began to prepare the tent. The last photograph in Krivonishenko's camera, developed weeks later, showed members of the group digging a platform into the snow, cutting blocks to secure the tent's edges. Someone was smiling. The light was fading. They erected the tent. They arranged their belongings inside immersive. They removed their outer layers and settled in for the night. Outside, the wind howled. The temperature continued to drop. And somewhere in the hours that followed, something happened that drove them to cut their way out of the tent and flee into the killing cold without adequate clothing, without boots, without the supplies that stood between them and death. The mountain waited. The wind erased their tracks. And 3 weeks would pass before the search party found the tent, collapsed beneath fresh snow slashed open from within. Chapter 2. Into the Taiga. The forest swallowed them whole on the 28th of January. Behind them, Vizhay grew small against the white expanse, its wooden structures fading into the general greyness of a winter morning in the northern Urals. Before them stretched the taiga, an ocean of conifers that ran for thousands of kilometers in every direction, broken only by frozen rivers and the occasional clearing where lightning or wind had felled the giants. The temperature held at 20 below zero. The sky was the color of old steel, and the 9 moved forward on their skis, pulling sledges laden with supplies, their breath forming clouds that dissipated instantly in the cold, dry air. Dyatlov led. He broke trail through snow that reached mid-thigh in places, his skis cutting parallel tracks that the others followed in single file. Behind him came Krivonishenko, then Doroshenko, then Kolmogorova, then the rest in an order that rotated throughout the day so that no single person bore the exhausting work of trail breaking for too long. The sledges dragged behind them on ropes tied to their waists. The loads were heavy but manageable. Each sledge carried a portion of the collective supplies, tent sections, food, fuel, tools. If one sledge broke or was lost, the group could still function. Redundancy was survival. The route followed the Lozva River valley northward. The river itself was frozen solid, its surface covered by a meter of snow, but the valley provided a natural corridor through the forest where travel was easier than forcing through dense timber. The trees here were primarily Siberian pine and fir, their trunks dark against the snow, their branches weighted with frost that fell in small cascades when the wind gusted. The silence was profound. No birds called, no animals moved. In winter at this latitude, the forest emptied of life. What remained either hibernated or travelled ceaselessly in search of food that scarcely existed. They covered 15 kilometers the first day. By late afternoon the light was failing. Dyatlov signalled a halt in a clearing where the trees opened enough to pitch the tent. The tent was a single large structure, designed to sleep 9, made of heavy canvas with a sewn-in floor and a stovepipe opening at one end. It required assembly. The group worked together with practiced efficiency. Some cleared snow to create a level platform. Others unpacked tent poles and canvas. Kolmogorova and Dubinina arranged the interior, laying down insulating mats and sleeping bags. Krivonishenko and Doroshenko, both experienced with winter camping stoves, set up the portable burner and began melting snow for water. The stove burned wood when available, pressed fuel tablettes when not. Tonight there was deadwood in the clearing, dry branches that had fallen and frozen and would burn hot despite the cold. Doroshenko gathered an armload. Inside the tent, as the stove began to radiate heat, the temperature rose from deadly to merely uncomfortable. They removed their outer layers. They hung damp clothing on lines strung across the tent's interior. They ate a meal of porridge and lard and black bread and drank tea brewed strong enough to taste of tannin and smoke. After the meal, someone produced a mandolin. Kolmogorova sang a folk song about a girl waiting for her lover to return from the sea. Her voice was clear and unself-conscious. The others joined in the chorus. Then Slobodin told a joke about an engineer, a physicist, and a bear that made everyone laugh. Zolotaryov smoked a cigarette near the tent entrance, the tip glowing orange in the darkness. He was older than the rest by more than a decade, a veteran of the war who had seen the siege of Stalingrad and the advance into Germany. He did not speak often, but when he did, the others listened. Tonight he said only that the forest reminded him of the Carpathians in winter, and that he was glad to be walking in mountains where no one was shooting. They settled into their sleeping bags as the stove burned low. Outside, the temperature dropped to 30 below. Inside, their combined body heat and the residual warmth from the stove kept the air just above freezing. They wore wool undergarments and hats. They kept their boots inside the sleeping bag so the leather would not freeze solid. Sleep came in shifts, interrupted by the need to adjust position or add another layer or step outside briefly to relieve oneself in the killing cold. No one slept deeply in winter camping. The body remained vigilant against the cold that waited to claim anyone who stayed still too long. Morning came slowly. The sun, when it rose, brought no warmth. They ate a cold breakfast, bread and butter and dried fruit, then packed the tent and resumed the march. The second day was harder than the first. The snow had drifted during the night, erasing their tracks from the previous afternoon, and the trail breaking required more effort. They took shorter turns at the front. The sledges caught on hidden stumps. Twice they had to stop and repair bindings on skis that had cracked in the extreme cold. By midday they reached a tributary of the Lozva where the ice was thinner and water seeped up through cracks, creating patches of slush that could soak through boots in seconds. Dyatlov led them wide around the danger zone, climbing onto the bank where the snow was deeper, but the footing was solid. They stopped for a brief rest. Dubinina produced a tin of condensed milk and passed it around. Each person took a spoonful. The sweetness was startling and welcome. In the afternoon they encountered the first signs of human presence they had seen since leaving Vizhay, a line of old surveyors' markers, wooden posts driven into the snow at intervals, marking a route used by geologists or hunters in previous seasons. The posts were weathered and leaning, half buried, but they confirmed that the group was travelling in the correct direction. Dyatlov noted their position in his journal. Kolmogorova photographed one of the markers with her camera. The image, developed later, showed a post leaning at 45 degrees, its top crusted with ice, the forest dark behind it. They camped that night in another clearing. The routine was the same: tent, stove, food, songs, sleep. Thibaut Brignol, who was skilled with tools, repaired a broken ski binding by firelight, carving a new notch in the wood and securing it with wire. Kurlevatov checked the group's fuel supply and calculated that they had enough for 12 more days of cooking, which allowed a margin of error if the return journey took longer than planned. Dyatlov reviewed the route map with Zolotaryov, tracing the line they would follow up the Ospaya River and across the highland plateau to Otorten. The older man suggested a slight variation that would keep them closer to the tree line in case weather forced them to descend quickly. Dyatlov considered this and made a note. The third day brought wind. It came from the north, carrying snow that stung exposed skin and reduced visibility to a few dozen meters. They travelled more slowly, stopping frequently to ensure they had not drifted off course. The river valley narrowed. The trees closed in. At one point they had to remove their skis and carry them while climbing over a jumble of fallen logs that blocked the path. The work was exhausting. Sweat soaked their inner layers, and when they stopped, the sweat froze. They learned to regulate their effort carefully, to move fast enough to stay warm, but not so fast that they overheated. By the fourth day, the 21st of January, they had travelled approximately 60 kilometres from Vizhay. The forest began to change. The trees grew shorter and more widely spaced. The terrain rose steadily. They were approaching the highlands, the transitional zone, where taiga gave way to alpine tundra. The wind was stronger here, less impeded by forest, and the snow was harder, compacted by constant exposure. Their skis glided more easily, but the cold was more penetrating. On the 31st of January, they reached the abandoned geologist's camp near the headwaters of the Ospaya River. The camp consisted of a single log hut, its roof partially collapsed, its door hanging from one hinge. Inside, the space was small, perhaps 3 meters by 4, but it was shelter from the wind. They spent the afternoon there, resting, sorting equipment, and preparing for the final push. Dyatlov decided they would leave behind everything not essential for the summit attempt. They cached food, spare clothing, tools, and even some of the cameras and journals. The cache would be retrieved on the return journey. Travelling light would allow them to move faster across the exposed high country. They wrote letters to be left at the hut. Dubinina wrote to her mother, describing the beauty of the taiga and her good spirits. Kolmogorova wrote to her younger brother, promising to bring him a stone from the summit of Otorten. Dyatlov wrote nothing personal but updated the expedition log with their position and the date and their intended route for the next 5 days. He noted that weather conditions were holding and that the group was in good health and morale was high. That night they slept inside the hut. It was warmer than the tent, though the wind found every gap in the logs and the cold seeped up through the floor. They crowded together for warmth. Someone told stories of previous expeditions, a near miss with an avalanche in the Caucasus, a river crossing in the Altai where the current had nearly swept away their supplies. The stories were told with laughter. the danger diminished by distance and survival. They were young. They had survived before. They would survive again. In the morning, they packed light rucksacks. They left the heavy sledges behind. They took only what they needed for a fast ascent and descent. Tent, sleeping bags, minimal food, stove, fuel. The total weight per person dropped to 15 kilograms. They felt almost unburdened. They left the hut in good spirits. The sky was overcast, but the wind had dropped. Dyatlov estimated they would reach a Taunton within 3 days and be back at the cache within 6. The mathematics of survival were simple. They had supplies, they had strength, they had each other. They moved north, climbing out of the forest onto the open slopes. Behind them, the hut disappeared into the general whiteness. Ahead, the mountains rose against the sky. And somewhere beyond the visible horizon, the peak called Taunton waited. Do not go there, a name spoken by the Mansi herders who grazed reindeer in these highlands during summer, and who knew enough to leave before winter locked the land in ice. The group did not speak the Mansi language. They did not know the stories behind the name. They knew only coordinates and elevation and the promise of achievement. They climbed toward the ridge. The forest thinned and fell away. And the wind, which had been merely cold in the shelter of the taiga, became something sharper, something that cut through wool and skin and found the blood beneath. Chapter 3. The ascent begins. The tree line ended abruptly. One moment the group moved through scattered stands of dwarf pine and stunted fir, their skis scraping over roots and hidden stones beneath the snow. The next, they emerged onto open tundra where nothing grew taller than a man's knee, and the wind moved unobstructed across kilometers of white plateau. The transition was stark. Behind them, the forest offered shelter, fuel, the psychological comfort of enclosure. Before them stretched emptiness, rolling highlands broken by rocky outcrops and shallow valleys, all of it buried beneath snow that the wind had sculpted into hard waves and ridges called sastrugi. The date was the 1st of February 1959. The temperature was 28 degrees below 0 Celsius. The sky was low and grey, pregnant with snow that had not yet fallen but would. Dyatlov called a brief halt to allow the group to add layers and adjust their equipment for the exposed terrain ahead. They pulled on extra wool sweaters. They wrapped scarves across their faces, leaving only their eyes exposed. They tightened the straps on their rucksacks and checked their ski bindings. Krivonishenko loaded a fresh roll of film into his camera. He wanted to document the highlands, the summit, the moment of achievement. They resumed the climb. The gradient was gentle but unrelenting. The elevation increased steadily from 900 meters above sea level toward the plateau at 1200 meters where a Taunton stood. The skiing was easier here than in the forest. No obstacles, no need to navigate around deadfall, but the exposure to wind drained energy faster than exertion. The cold was no longer something external that could be defended against with shelter and fire. It was ambient, totalizing, a condition of existence that penetrated every layer and every thought. They travelled in single file, each person following the tracks of the one ahead, their bodies bent slightly forward against the wind. Speech was difficult. The wind tore words away before they could be heard. Communication reduced to hand signals and the occasional shout. They moved through a landscape emptied of features. The horizon disappeared into the white sky. Distance became impossible to judge. A rock outcrop that appeared close might be a kilometre away. The mountains themselves, which should have been visible as landmarks, were hidden behind curtains of blowing snow. By midday, Dyatlov consulted his compass and map. They had drifted slightly west of the intended route. The wind and the lack of visible landmarks had pushed them off course. He corrected their heading, turning them more directly north toward where a Taunton should stand. The adjustment was minor. They were not lost, but the incident reminded everyone how easy it would be to become disoriented in whiteout conditions, to wander in circles until exhaustion and cold claimed them. They stopped for a brief meal in the lee of a low ridge that offered minimal shelter from the wind. They sat on their rucksacks and ate bread and chocolate and drank tea from thermoses that had been filled that morning. The tea was lukewarm but still liquid. They ate quickly. Sitting still in the cold was dangerous. The body's core temperature dropped rapidly without movement. Already their feet were numb. Their fingers ached inside their gloves. Dubinina stamped her feet and swung her arms to force circulation. Slobodin, who had experienced frostbite on a previous expedition, checked his nose and cheeks for the telltale white patches that indicated tissue damage. He found none yet. After 15 minutes they moved on. The afternoon brought no improvement in conditions. The wind strengthened. The snow began to fall, not heavy but constant, small hard pellets that struck exposed skin like grains of sand, and visibility dropped to less than 50 meters. Dyatlov made another decision. They would not attempt to reach Otorten today. They would find a suitable camping spot, pitch the tent and wait for better weather. Pushing forward blindly in deteriorating conditions was how expeditions died. But finding a campsite on the exposed plateau proved difficult. The ground was uniformly sloped. There were no clearings, no natural shelters, no level ground suitable for a tent. They continued north and slightly east, descending gradually, hoping to find a more protected position. The light was fading. In the subarctic in February, darkness came early. By 4 in the afternoon, the sky was dimming toward dusk. They crested a low rise and found themselves on the upper slopes of a mountain. It was not Otorten. Dyatlov checked his position and realized they had veered too far west onto the flanks of another peak, one that did not appear on their map by name, but which local Mansi herders called Kholat Shakal. The name meant Dead Mountain or Bald Mountain, referring to the absence of trees on its upper slopes. The group had no way of knowing this. To them, it was simply an unnamed elevation, an obstacle between their current position and their destination. Dyatlov faced a choice. They could descend back into the valley they had climbed out of that morning, losing altitude and time, and search for a campsite in the forested lowlands. Or they could pitch the tent here on the mountainside and continue the route correction in the morning when visibility improved. The first option was safer but would cost them half a day. The second option was exposed but would keep them on schedule. He chose to camp on the slope. The group was experienced. They had camped in worse conditions. The wind, while strong, was not yet at storm force. They had adequate supplies and equipment. And descending in fading light through snow-covered terrain carried its own risks. A twisted ankle, a fall, separation in the darkness. They found a relatively level spot on the mountainside at an elevation of approximately 900 meters. The slope fell away below them toward the valley. Above, the mountain's bare shoulder rose another 300 meters into the cloud. The wind came from the northwest, quartering across the slope. It was not ideal, but it would suffice for one night. They began to prepare the tent. The work was harder than usual. The snow on the slope had been compacted by wind into a surface nearly as hard as ice. Digging into it required significant effort. They used saws and axes to cut blocks of snow that could be piled around the tent's perimeter to serve as windbreaks and anchors. The work generated heat. They removed their outer jackets. Sweat dampened their inner layers despite the cold. Krivonishenko took photographs of the tent preparation. The images, recovered weeks later, showed figures bundled in dark clothing cutting into white snow under a grey sky. Someone was smiling. The mood, despite the difficult conditions, appeared calm. They had done this many times before. The routine was familiar: tent, stove, food, sleep. Tomorrow they would correct their route and continue toward Otorten. The tent went up as darkness completed its fall. They secured the canvas with ropes tied to skis and ski poles driven into the snow. They piled the cut snow blocks around the base. Inside, they laid down insulating mats and arranged their sleeping bags in a row along the tent's length. 9 sleeping bags, 9 people, pressed close together for warmth. The tent's interior measured approximately 5 meters by 4, cramped but manageable. Krivonishenko and Doroshenko set up the stove near the entrance. They lit a fire using pressed fuel tablets. The stove began to warm the tent's interior. Outside, the wind continued to blow. The temperature was falling toward 30 below. But inside, the space became almost comfortable. They removed their outer layers. They hung damp clothing on lines. They prepared a meal, porridge and dried meat and tea. The mood was subdued but not anxious. They were tired from the day's exertion. They ate in relative silence, punctuated by occasional remarks about the route or the weather, or small observations about equipment performance. Dubnina wrote a brief entry in her journal, noting the difficult conditions, and her hope that tomorrow would bring clearer skies. Kolmogorova checked her feet for signs of frostbite and found only redness. Thibaut Brignol repaired a torn strap on his rucksack. Zolotaryov, the oldest member, sat near the tent entrance smoking. He had been quieter than usual throughout the day. When Dyatlov asked if he was well, he said only that his old war wound ached in the cold. A piece of shrapnel still lodged near his spine that troubled him in winter. But he was fine. He had endured worse. He stubbed out his cigarette and moved deeper into the tent. By 8 in the evening, they had settled into their sleeping bags. The stove was allowed to burn low. They would not keep it lit through the night. The risk of carbon monoxide build-up in the enclosed space was too great. They would rely on their sleeping bags and body heat to survive the night. It would be uncomfortable but not dangerous if they stayed inside the tent, sheltered from the wind. Outside, the wind increased. It howled across the mountainside with a sound like sustained breath. Snow began to accumulate on the tent's windward side, adding weight to the canvas. The tent poles creaked but held. Inside, the 9 lay close together in their sleeping bags, wearing wool hats and inner layers, their boots tucked into the bags to keep them from freezing. No one knows what happened in the hours that followed. No one survived to tell. But at some point during that night, whether early or late, whether gradually or suddenly, something drove them to take knives and slash open the side of the tent from the inside. Not the entrance. The entrance was accessible. They cut through the canvas as if the seconds required to unlace the entrance were seconds they could not afford to lose. They fled into the night wearing only the clothing they had on inside the tent. Wool undergarments, thin sweaters, socks or single boots or nothing on their feet. They left behind their outer jackets, their felt boots, their supplies. They left the tent standing with their belongings inside. They left the flashlight on, still burning when the search party found it 3 weeks later. They fled downslope towards the forest, toward the tree line 1,500 meters below. The temperature was 30 degrees below zero. The wind was strong enough to knock a person off their feet, and they ran or walked quickly or stumbled through the darkness down the snow-covered slope toward a stand of cedar trees at the forest's edge. 9 sets of footprints led away from the tent. Some were barefoot, some were in socks, some wore a single boot. The prints were clear in the snow, showing that they had left in an organized manner, not scattered into panic, but in a group, moving together down the slope. Whatever had driven them from the tent had not caused immediate chaos. They had exited together. They had moved with purpose, but purpose was not enough against the cold. The mountain waited. The wind erased their voices, and history, which had watched 1,000 such deaths in frozen places, prepared to watch another. Chapter 4. The Slashed Canvas. The search began on the 15th of February, 1959. The Dyatlov group had been due to return to Vigier by the 12th, and to send a telegram confirming their safe arrival. When the telegram did not come, there was no immediate alarm. Delays were common in winter expeditions. Weather could pin a group down for days. River crossings took longer than planned. Equipment broke. The return date was a target, not a contract. The sports club at the Ural Polytechnic Institute waited through the 12th and the 13th and the 14th. By the 15th, concern had deepened into worry. By the 16th, worry had become action. The families of the missing students demanded a search. The institute organized volunteers, other students, faculty members, mountaineering clubs from across the region. The Soviet military was contacted. The Regional Communist Party Committee became involved. This was not merely a matter of lost hikers. These were Soviet citizens, educated youth, the future engineers and technicians the state had invested in training. Their loss would be both personal tragedy and political embarrassment. On the 20th of February, the first search parties departed for the northern Urals. They included students and instructors from the Polytechnic Institute, experienced mountaineers familiar with the region, local Mansi guides who knew the terrain, and eventually soldiers and helicopters from the Soviet military. The operation was coordinated by the regional branch of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. It was the largest search operation in the history of the Ural region. The search teams travelled first to Vizhay, then north along the Dyatlov group's known route up the Lozva River Valley. They found the first camps easily: fire sites, ski tracks, the places where the tent had been pitched on the journey north. They found the abandoned geologist's hut where the group had stored their cache. Inside were the supplies the Dyatlov group had left behind: food, equipment, journals. The journals contained entries up to the 31st of January. Everything was in order. There were no signs of distress. From the hut, the search parties pushed north onto the highlands. The weather was clear now, the wind calm, the visibility good, conditions that mocked the difficulty of the search with their benign indifference. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the plateau, their pilots scanning for any sign of the tent or the group. On the ground, search teams moved on skis, spreading out in lines, calling the names of the missing into the empty air. On the 26th of February, a search team led by students from the Institute found the tent. It was located on the slope of the mountain the Mansi called Kholat Shyakal, at an elevation of 900 meters, partially collapsed and buried under snow that had accumulated over the 3.5 weeks since the group's disappearance. The tent's position was immediately recognizable as wrong. It was on an exposed slope with no natural shelter, far from the tree line, in a location no experienced winter camper would choose unless circumstances left no better option. The search team approached cautiously. The tent was intact, not torn apart by animals or destroyed by avalanche. It was simply there, half buried, its canvas sagging under the weight of snow. They began to clear the snow away. As they worked, they noticed something that made them stop and call for others. The tent had been cut open from the inside. Long slashes ran through the canvas on the side facing downslope. The cuts were clean, made with knives, made by hands inside the tent. The entrance was still laced shut. Whoever had made the cuts had not used the entrance. They had cut their way out through the side of the tent as if seconds mattered, as if waiting to unlace the entrance was a delay they could not afford. Inside the tent, everything was in order. The sleeping bags were laid out. Clothing was folded or hanging on lines. Boots stood neatly arranged. There were jackets, felt boots, spare gloves. There was food, a half-eaten tin of condensed milk, a loaf of bread, dried meat. There were personal items, journals, cameras, a mandolin, Zolotaryov's tobacco pouch. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no damage except for the slashes in the canvas. On a supply bag near the entrance, someone had placed a flashlight. It was turned on. Its batteries were dead now, but when found, the switch was still in the on position. The flashlight had been left burning as if to mark the tent's location or to provide light for someone planning to return, but no one had returned. The search team examined the area around the tent. The snow had been disturbed during the tent setup. Blocks had been cut and piled as anchors and windbreaks. But beyond this immediate area leading downslope toward the forest, they found tracks. The tracks were partially filled with snow and wind-scoured, but they were visible. 9 sets of tracks. Some were barefoot. Some were in socks. Some showed the impression of a single boot. The tracks descended the slope in a roughly parallel path, staying close together, not scattered in random panic. The tracks were consistent with people walking, not running, but walking with purpose and speed down the mountainside. The stride length suggested urgency, but not chaotic flight. And crucially, the tracks showed no signs of the group being chased or pursued. There were only the 9 sets of prints, no others, no animal tracks, nothing that suggested an external threat had followed them from the tent. The search team followed the tracks. They led down the slope for approximately 1,500 meters, descending through zones of increasingly deep snow toward the forest edge where the tree line began. The slope was steep enough that footing would have been treacherous in darkness, especially for people without proper footwear. The temperature on the night of February 1st would have been at least 30 degrees below zero. Walking in such cold in undergarments and socks was a death sentence measured in minutes. At the tree line, the tracks disappeared into the forest. The search team spread out, calling, searching, looking for any sign. They found it under a tall cedar tree that stood at the forest's edge, approximately 300 meters inside the tree line from where the slope ended. Under the cedar tree, they found the bodies of Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko. Both men were dead. Both were dressed in only undergarments, wool long underwear, thin shirts, no outer layers, no jackets. Doroshenko wore a single sock. Krivonishenko was barefoot. Their bodies were frozen solid, their skin waxy and pale. Their hands curled. They lay near each other, close to the remains of a small fire that had burned and gone out. The fire had been built directly on the snow. Branches had been piled. The fire had burned long enough to char some of the wood, but not long enough to sustain warmth sufficient to save them. Around the fire were scraps of bark and small broken branches. Above, on the cedar tree itself, the search team noticed something strange. Branches had been broken off at a height of up to 5 meters above the ground. The breaks were fresh, made recently, with force, by someone climbing the tree and breaking off the dry dead branches for fuel. Bits of bark and broken twigs littered the snow beneath the tree. Whoever had climbed the tree had done so without proper clothing in the dark, in desperate need of fuel to keep the fire burning. On the bodies themselves, there were no obvious external injuries, no wounds, no signs of violence. But the way they lay, close to the fire, curled slightly, their hands near their faces, suggested they had died of hypothermia. They had built a fire. They had tried to stay warm. And when the fire went out, or when their bodies could no longer generate heat faster than the cold stole it away, they had simply stopped. The search team marked the location and continued searching the area. If 2 bodies were here, the others might be nearby. They searched through the forest, through the snow, calling names. For hours they found nothing. Then, as afternoon light began to fail, a search team member found a 3rd body on the slope between the cedar tree and the tent. It was Dyatlov himself. He lay face up in the snow, approximately 300 meters upslope from the cedar tree, as if he had been trying to return to the tent. He was dressed in undergarments and a single boot. His arms were positioned as if he had been trying to protect his face from the cold. There were no external injuries. Like the others, he appeared to have died of exposure. Within the next hour, 2 more bodies were found, both on the slope between Dyatlov and the cedar tree. One was Zinaida Kolmogorova lying face down approximately 100 meters from Dyatlov. The other was Rustam Slobodin, another 100 meters farther down toward the cedar. Both were in undergarments. Both had no significant external injuries. The pattern was clear. After fleeing the tent and reaching the cedar tree, some members of the group had attempted to return to the tent. They had not made it. The cold had claimed them one by one on the slope. 5 bodies had been found. 4 were still missing: Dubinina, Kolovatov, Thibaut Brignol, and Zolotaryov. The search continued through the following days. Helicopters flew constant patrols, ground teams combed the forest and the ravines that cut through the mountainside. But the snow was deep, the terrain was broken and difficult, and the 4 missing members remained unfound. By early March, the search was scaled back. The 5 recovered bodies were transported to Ivdel for autopsy. The tent and its contents were carefully documented and removed from the mountain. The area around the tent and the cedar tree was photographed extensively. Every detail was recorded, and the question that had no answer hung over everything like the cold itself. Why had they cut the tent open from inside and fled into the killing cold? There was no avalanche. The tent still stood, its contents undisturbed. There was no fire inside the tent, no burns, no smoke damage. There was no evidence of animal attack, no tracks, no claw marks, no blood. There was no sign of other humans. No tracks except the 9 sets leading down the slope. and there was no rational explanation for why 9 experienced winter campers would abandon a shelter filled with warm clothing and supplies to die of exposure in the forest below. The mountain offered no answers. The tent held no secrets beyond the slashes in its canvas, and the wind that had blown on that February night blew still, erasing tracks, filling in hollows, covering the past with fresh snow as if the event had never occurred. But 4 bodies remained unfound, and their discovery, when it came 2 months later, would deepen the mystery rather than solve it. Chapter 5: The Cedar and the Fire. The autopsies began on the 4th of March in the morgue at Ivdel. The pathologist assigned to the case was a man named Boris Alexeyevich Vozrojdeny, a medical examiner with decades of experience who had performed hundreds of autopsies on bodies recovered from industrial accidents, drownings, and exposure deaths across the Ural region. He approached the examination of the 5 recovered bodies with professional detachment, expecting to confirm what the physical evidence already suggested: death by hypothermia. A tragic but straightforward case of exposure following some unknown incident that had driven the group from their tent. The bodies arrived at the morgue frozen solid. They had to be thawed before examination could proceed. The process took hours. The bodies were laid out on metal tables in a room kept deliberately cold to slow decomposition. As they thawed, Vozrojdeny documented their external appearance, their clothing, their positions, any visible injuries or anomalies. Yuri Doroshenko was examined first. He was 21 years old, a geologist, one of the 2 found beneath the cedar tree. His body was dressed only in long underwear, a wool undershirt and wool underpants. He wore a single wool sock on his left foot. His right foot was bare. Around his leg someone had tied a woolen wrap that did not belong to his own clothing. His hands showed signs of burns, 1st and 2nd degree burns on the fingers and palms, consistent with handling burning branches or attempting to hold hands too close to fire. The skin of his face and extremities showed the waxy discoloration of severe frostbite. Vozrojdeny opened the body. The internal organs showed no trauma. The lungs contained some fluid consistent with the body's position during thawing. The heart was normal. The stomach contained partially digested food. There were no signs of disease or pre-existing conditions that might have contributed to death. The cause of death was recorded as hypothermia. The core body temperature had dropped below the level necessary to sustain life, and the heart had stopped. But there were details that troubled the pathologist. Doroshenko's hands and knuckles showed abrasions and small cuts, as if he had been climbing or gripping something rough. His fingertips were damaged, the nails torn, consistent with someone who had been breaking branches or climbing a tree with bare hands in extreme cold. And there was the matter of the clothing wrapped around his leg, wool fabric that did not match any of his own garments. Someone had cut or torn clothing from another person and wrapped it around Doroshenko's leg, presumably to protect against the cold, but the wrapping had not been sufficient. Georgy Krivonyshenko was examined next. He was 23 years old, an engineer who worked at a nuclear facility in Chelyabinsk. He had been found beside Doroshenko beneath the cedar. He wore even less, only wool underwear and a torn undershirt. Both his feet were bare. Like Doroshenko, his hands showed burns. His fingers were charred in places, the skin blackened and split, evidence of desperate attempts to maintain the fire or to handle burning wood without gloves or protection. Krivonyshenko's body showed similar internal findings: no trauma, no disease, death by hypothermia, but his mouth and throat contained traces of blood. Vozrojdeny noted that the tongue and oral cavity showed signs of damage, possibly from biting during convulsions caused by severe hypothermia. The body's extremities were severely frostbitten. Tissue samples taken from the hands and feet showed ice crystal formation in the cells, indicating that freezing had occurred before death. The pathologist noted in his report that both men appeared to have died while conscious and aware. Hypothermia typically progressed through stages: initial shivering and discomfort, followed by confusion and loss of coordination, followed by drowsiness and finally unconsciousness and death. but the evidence of their hands, the burns, the abrasions, the torn fingernails, suggested they had remained active until very near the end, trying to maintain the fire, trying to break branches, trying to survive. Igor Dyatlov was examined third. He was the expedition leader, 23 years old, found on the slope between the cedar tree and the tent. He wore a wool undershirt, long underwear, and a single felt boot on his right foot. His left foot was bare. Unlike the two found at the cedar, Dyatlov showed no burns on his hands. His body showed extensive frostbite, but no external injuries beyond minor abrasions. The autopsy revealed no internal trauma. The cause of death was hypothermia, but Dyatlov's position on the slope, 300 meters from the cedar facing uphill toward the tent, suggested he had been attempting to return. He had left the relative shelter of the forest and the fire, and had tried to climb back up the exposed slope to the tent where the warm clothing and supplies remained. He had not made it. The cold and the exertion had drained what little warmth remained in his body, and he had collapsed in the snow. Zinaida Kolmogorova was examined fourth. She was 22 years old, a radio engineering student. She had been found 100 meters downslope from Dyatlov, also facing uphill. She wore long underwear, 2 pairs of wool socks, and a torn sweater. Her hands showed signs of frostbite but no burns. There was dried blood on her face, possibly from a nosebleed caused by the cold or from hitting her face on the snow during a fall. Internally, Kolmogorova showed no trauma. Death was by hypothermia. Like Dyatlov, her position suggested she had been trying to return to the tent. She had made it farther than Slobodin, but not as far as Dyatlov. She had fallen or collapsed and had not risen again. Rustem Slobodin was the last of the 5 to be examined. He was 23 years old, found between Kolmogorova and the cedar tree. He wore long underwear, a single felt boot and a wool hat. His body showed frostbite and minor abrasions. But there was one detail that stood out: a small fracture to the skull, a linear crack approximately 6 centimeters long on the right side of the head. The fracture was not severe. It had not penetrated the inner table of the skull. There was no significant hemorrhage. It was the kind of injury that might result from a fall on ice or a blow from a blunt object. Voz Rizhdeni noted the skull fracture but concluded it was not the cause of death. The fracture could have occurred during the descent from the tent in darkness over rough terrain. Slobodin might have slipped and struck his head on a rock or ice. The injury would have been painful and possibly disorienting, but not immediately fatal. Death had come from hypothermia, the same as the others. The pathologist completed his examinations and filed his reports with the investigative committee. 5 bodies, 5 deaths by hypothermia. The pattern was consistent. The group had fled the tent in inadequate clothing, had reached the forest, had attempted to build a fire, and had succumbed to the cold one by one. Some had tried to return to the tent. None had succeeded, but the reports raised as many questions as they answered. Why had they fled? What had driven them from the tent in such haste that they did not take 30 seconds to put on boots or grab jackets? And why, once at the cedar tree with a fire burning, had some of them decided to leave the fire and attempt the climb back to the tent through the darkness and the killing cold? The investigator assigned to the case, a senior prosecutor named Lev Nikitich Ivanov, reviewed the autopsy reports and the physical evidence. He interviewed the search party members. He examined the tent and its contents. He walked the route from the tent to the cedar tree. He stood on the slope in daylight and tried to imagine what it would have been like in darkness at 30 below zero, with wind howling across the exposed mountainside. He found no answers that satisfied the requirements of logic. An avalanche could have prompted flight from the tent, but there was no avalanche. The tent stood intact. The slope above showed no signs of snow movement. An attack by animals could explain panic, but there were no animal tracks, no signs of struggle, no wounds on the bodies beyond the minor abrasions consistent with movement over rough terrain. An attack by humans, perhaps local Mansi tribesmen angered by the intrusion into their territory, could explain flight, but again there were no tracks, no weapon marks, no evidence of anyone else in the area. The tent itself provided no clues. The slashes in the canvas were made from inside deliberately, with knives carried by the group. The contents were undisturbed. There was no fire damage, no carbon monoxide, no structural failure that would have made the tent uninhabitable. Whatever had happened inside the minds of the 9 people in that tent. Some perception or experience that had convinced them their only chance of survival lay in immediate flight into conditions that were themselves lethal. Ivanov considered psychological explanations. Mass panic could cause irrational behavior, but these were experienced winter campers, not novices prone to hysteria. They had faced cold and wind before. They knew the protocols for survival. And the evidence of their tracks, walking together down the slope in an organized manner rather than scattering in random directions, suggested they had retained some capacity for rational thought and group cohesion even after leaving the tent. He considered medical explanations. Carbon monoxide poisoning from the stove could cause confusion and irrational behavior, but carbon monoxide typically caused drowsiness and loss of consciousness, not sudden panic. And if they had been confused by carbon monoxide, why had they moved with such purpose down the slope? Why had they built a fire at the cedar tree? Why had some attempted to return to the tent? The investigation stalled. 5 bodies had been recovered and examined. 4 remained missing. The coming of spring would melt the snow and perhaps reveal the last 4, but until then, there was nothing to do but wait and compile reports that documented mystery rather than solved it. In Sverdlovsk, the families of the dead gathered at the Institute for a memorial service. Photographs of the 5 were displayed. Speeches were made about their dedication to Soviet sport and their spirit of adventure. The official cause of death was listed as hypothermia, resulting from an unknown compelling force. The phrase was vague enough to encompass any explanation without committing to any specific one. The 4 missing were not forgotten. Their families held hope that they might somehow have survived, though every rational assessment suggested otherwise. If 5 had died within hours of leaving the tent, the other 4, subjected to the same cold, could not have lasted longer unless they had found better shelter or had been better dressed. But the evidence suggested the opposite. The 4 who remained unfound had been among those wearing the least clothing when the group fled. Winter gave way to spring. The snow on the mountain began to melt. The search parties returned to the mountain in early May. They brought dogs and probes and more searchers. They concentrated on the ravines and gullies near the cedar tree, areas where deep snow might have hidden bodies for months. On the 4th of May, 1959, the bodies of the remaining 4 were found. They were not at the cedar tree. They were not on the slope. They were 75 meters downstream from the cedar in a ravine where snowmelt water had begun to flow, buried beneath 4 meters of compacted snow in a small hollow formed by the ravine's contours. The discovery of the 4 bodies would transform the investigation from a tragic case of death by exposure into something far stranger and more disturbing, because when the pathologist examined these 4, he found injuries that hypothermia alone could not explain. Chapter 6. The Ravine. The ravine ran perpendicular to the slope, cutting through the forest floor in a shallow depression that collected snow throughout the winter until it lay banked 4 meters deep between low walls of frozen earth and stone. In summer, a small stream would flow here, carrying snowmelt down the mountain toward larger tributaries. In winter, it was merely a fold in the terrain, invisible beneath accumulated snow, a place where depth and concealment made it both a potential shelter and a potential tomb. The search party found the bodies on the 4th of May. Spring had come to the Urals. The temperature had risen above freezing during the day. Snow was melting rapidly on the exposed slopes. Water flowed in channels cut through the winter's accumulation. The forest floor, which had been buried beneath meters of snow in February, was beginning to emerge. Dark earth, fallen branches, the remnants of last autumn's leaves. The searchers had concentrated their efforts near the cedar tree where the first 2 bodies had been found. They used long metal probes to test the depth and consistency of the remaining snow, searching for anomalies that might indicate a body beneath. One such probe, pushed into the snow in the ravine, struck something that was neither rock nor frozen earth. The searchers dug. 4 meters down, buried beneath compacted snow and a layer of ice formed by repeated melting and refreezing, they found a platform made of cut fir branches laid carefully across the ravine floor. The platform was approximately 1.5 meters wide and 2 meters long, constructed from 14 or 15 branches, each cut cleanly from nearby trees, laid parallel to form a mat. Someone had built this platform deliberately, taking the time to cut branches and arrange them. The purpose appeared to be insulation, to create a barrier between human bodies and the frozen ground beneath. On and near this platform of branches lay 4 bodies. They had been here since February 1st, frozen, buried, preserved by cold and snow for 3 months. As the searchers carefully removed snow and ice, the bodies emerged, twisted, frozen in positions of death, their clothing torn and incomplete. The 4 were Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Semyon Zolotaryov. They were the members of the group who had carried the most experience. Dubinina with her Caucasus expeditions, Zolotaryov with his war service and decades of winter camping. They had survived the flight from the tent, they had reached the forest, and somehow they had ended up here in the ravine, 75 meters from the cedar tree, beneath 4 meters of snow. The bodies were carefully extracted and transported to Ivdel for autopsy. The pathologist Vozrojdeny, who had examined the first 5 bodies 2 months earlier, performed the examinations on the 10th and 11th of May. What he found was profoundly disturbing. Lyudmila Dubinina was dressed in torn and tattered clothing, pieces of wool fabric, remnants of undergarments, strips of cloth that appeared to have been cut from other garments and wrapped around her limbs. Her feet were wrapped in torn pieces of wool trousers. She wore no intact outer clothing. When Vozrojdeny opened the body and examined the internal structures, he found massive trauma. Dubinina's chest showed multiple rib fractures. Ribs 2 through 7 on the right side were broken, symmetrically, with fracture lines that suggested a single powerful force applied to the chest. The fractures were fresh, not old injuries. They had occurred at or near the time of death. The pattern of fracture was consistent with severe blunt force trauma, the kind produced by an impact or crushing force of significant magnitude. More disturbing was the state of the mouth and the throat. Dubinina's tongue was missing. The soft tissue of the floor of the mouth and the upper throat had been removed or destroyed. The hyoid bone, a small delicate bone in the throat, was intact, ruling out manual strangulation. But the tongue and surrounding tissue were simply gone. Vozrojdeny noted in his report that the tissue loss could be consistent with decomposition in flowing water. The ravine would have collected snowmelt, but the body had been frozen solid for 3 months, and the amount of decomposition seemed excessive for the conditions. Semyon Zolotaryov, examined next, showed similar injuries. His chest exhibited multiple rib fractures on the right side, ribs 2 through 6 broken in a symmetric pattern. Like Dubinina, the fractures were fresh and consistent with severe blunt force trauma. His eyes were missing from their sockets, but Vozrojdeny noted this could be attributed to decomposition and scavenging by small animals or birds before the snow fully covered the body. Zolotaryov was dressed more completely than the others. He wore a wool sweater, undergarments, and wrapped felt boots. Around his neck he wore a camera on a strap, the same camera he had carried throughout the expedition, though the film inside was later found to be too damaged by moisture to develop. He also wore a woman's wool hat and a wool cloth wrapped around his head and face. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol showed massive skull trauma. The right side of his skull was fractured extensively, a depressed fracture that had driven fragments of bone into the brain. The injury was severe, the kind that would cause immediate loss of consciousness and likely death within minutes or hours. The fracture pattern was consistent with a heavy blow from a blunt object or a fall onto a rock from significant height. But the fracture showed no corresponding soft tissue injury on the scalp, no bruising, no laceration. The skull had been broken by force applied before or shortly after death, but the overlying tissue showed minimal damage. Alexander Kolevatov showed the least external trauma of the four. His body was dressed in undergarments and wrapped fabric. He had no major fractures, no obvious injuries. Cause of death was listed as hypothermia, though he had survived long enough to reach the ravine and to be with the others when they finally succumbed. Vozrozh Denny documented all findings meticulously. He measured the fractures, he photographed the injuries, he took tissue samples, and in his conclusions, he noted that the severity of the chest trauma found in Dubinina and Zolotaryov was extraordinary. The force required to produce such injuries was equivalent to what one might see in a high-speed automobile collision or a fall from great height. The fractures were not caused by a punch or kick from a human attacker. The force was simply too great. And yet there were no external wounds, no bruising or lacerations corresponding to the internal damage. In the pathologist's experience, the only comparable injuries he had seen were in victims of severe car accidents. He wrote in his report that the trauma was consistent with forces that no human being could produce through physical attack, but rather required something of much greater magnitude, a fall, a collapse, an impact of extraordinary violence. Yet the bodies showed no signs of external impact. The skin was intact except for minor abrasions and the tissue loss around Dubinina's mouth. There were no fractures of the limbs, no defensive wounds on the hands or arms. Whatever had broken their ribs and crushed their chests had done so without leaving marks on the surface. The investigator Ivanov reviewed these new findings with deepening confusion. The first 5 bodies had presented a clear if mysterious picture, death by exposure following flight from the tent. But these 4 presented a different picture entirely. They had survived longer than the first 5. They had made it farther into the forest. They had built the platform of branches in the ravine, suggesting they had retained enough function and cognition to perform complex tasks. And then they had suffered massive trauma that seemed inconsistent with anything in the environment or with attack by humans or animals. Ivanov returned to the mountain. He examined the ravine. He measured the depth, the slope, and the distance from the cedar tree. He looked for rocks or outcrops that might have caused falls. He found nothing that explained the injuries. The ravine was not deep enough for a fatal fall. There were no large rocks or ice formations that could have collapsed onto the bodies. The branches that formed the platform showed no bloodstains, no signs that violence had occurred on or near them. He interviewed the search party members who had found the bodies. They described the scene, the 4 lying in the ravine, the platform of branches, the torn clothing. One detail caught Ivanov's attention. Some of the clothing on the bodies in the ravine had been cut from the bodies found earlier. Dubinina wore pieces of Krivonishenko's wool trousers wrapped around her feet. Zolotaryov wore a sweater that appeared to have come from Dubinina originally. The 4 in the ravine had taken clothing from the 2 who died at the cedar tree. This suggested a timeline. The group had fled the tent together. They had reached the cedar tree. Krivonishenko and Doroshenko had died first, either from hypothermia or from injuries sustained during the flight. The remaining 7, desperate for any additional insulation against the cold, had cut clothing from the dead and redistributed it among the living. At some point, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin had attempted to return to the tent. They had died on the slope. The last 4, Dubinina, Kolevatov, Thibaut Brignol and Zolotaryov, had moved from the cedar tree to the ravine, perhaps seeking better shelter, perhaps following the terrain down slope. They had built the platform, and there they had suffered the injuries that killed them. But when had the injuries occurred? Had they fallen? Had something collapsed on them? Had the 4 meters of snow that eventually buried them somehow crushed them, though snow typically distributed weight evenly and did not cause localized trauma? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. Ivanov ordered additional tests. He requested radiation surveys of the clothing. Soviet nuclear facilities existed in the Urals. Krivonishenko had worked at one. Perhaps there was contamination that might explain unusual circumstances. The tests came back showing elevated levels of radiation on some clothing samples, but the levels were low and inconsistent, possibly from contamination at Krivonishenko's workplace or from naturally occurring radioactive minerals in the soil. The investigation had now been running for 3 months. 9 bodies had been recovered. 9 autopsies had been completed. Hundreds of pages of reports had been filed. And the only conclusion the investigator could reach was that the deaths had been caused by an unknown compelling force which the hikers were unable to overcome. In May of 1959, Lev Ivanov closed the case. He cited lack of evidence of criminal activity. He noted that death had been caused by severe hypothermia in 5 cases, and by hypothermia combined with trauma in 4 cases, with the trauma resulting from unknown causes. He made no determination about what had driven the group from the tent or what had caused the injuries to the 4 found in the ravine. The case files were sealed. The families were given death certificates listing hypothermia as cause of death. The region around the mountain was closed to expeditions and hikers for the next 3 years. And the mountain itself, which had been marked on maps as Peak 1079 for its elevation in meters, began to be known by a different name, Dyatlov Pass, named for the young man who had led his friends into the wilderness and never led them out. Chapter 7. The Last Thaw. 3. The 3 who tried to return died alone on the slope between the shelter of the forest and the shelter of the tent they had abandoned. They had left the cedar tree where the fire burned low, and the 2 men lay dying or dead. They had walked away from the ravine where 4 others huddled on a platform of cut branches. They had chosen to climb back up the exposed mountainside through darkness and wind and cold that was measured not in degrees, but in minutes of consciousness, remaining before the body surrendered. Igor Dyatlov made it farthest. He was found 300 meters from the cedar tree, 90 meters from where the slope leveled onto the plateau where the tent stood. His body lay face up in the snow, his arms slightly raised as if he had been trying to shield his face from the wind. He wore long wool underwear, a single felt boot on his right foot and nothing else. His left foot was bare. The skin of his face and hands showed severe frostbite. Ice had formed in his hair. His eyes were closed. The position of his body and the direction he faced suggested he had been climbing toward the tent when he fell or collapsed. Perhaps he had believed he could reach it. Perhaps he had thought that if he could just get to the warm clothing and sleeping bags inside, he could survive. The distance was not far, 90 meters. In daylight, in summer, it would take less than a minute to walk, but in February darkness at 30 below zero in a single boot and underwear, it might as well have been 90 kilometers. Hypothermia progressed in stages. First came the cold that could be fought. Shivering, discomfort, the body's attempt to generate heat through muscle movement. Then came the loss of fine motor control, fingers that would not grip, hands that trembled too violently to perform simple tasks. Then came confusion and loss of judgment, the mind beginning to fail as the core temperature dropped and the brain received less oxygen. Then came what was called paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where victims of severe hypothermia felt overwhelmingly hot and removed their clothing, a final trick played by a dying nervous system. And finally came unconsciousness and death as the heart, deprived of warmth, simply stopped. Dyatlov had passed through all these stages except perhaps the last. His clothing had not been removed through paradoxical undressing. He had left the tent wearing only underwear and had never had outer layers to remove. His judgment had remained functional enough to attempt the climb back to shelter. But somewhere on that slope his body had reached its limit. His legs had given out. He had fallen, and he had not risen. The snow where he lay showed signs that he had moved after falling. His arms had shifted. His legs had drawn up slightly. These were the final movements of a body in the last stages of hypothermia. Small adjustments, attempts to curl into a protective position, the organism's final efforts to conserve what little heat remained. And then stillness. And then death. When the search party found him on February 27th, nearly 4 weeks after his death, his body was frozen solid. The cold that had killed him had also preserved him. His face was recognizable. His watch had stopped at 5:31, though whether that was evening or morning no one could say. The calendar dial showed February 1. His hands showed no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. He had simply climbed until he could climb no more. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found 100 meters below Dyatlov, closer to the tree line. She lay face down in the snow as if she had been crawling when she died. Her body was positioned with arms extended forward, hands curled, knees slightly bent. She wore long underwear, 2 pairs of wool socks, and a torn sweater. Her face was turned to the side. There was dried blood around her nose and mouth where she had struck the snow during her final collapse. Like Dyatlov, she appeared to have been trying to return to the tent. The distance was greater for her, approximately 200 meters from where she died to where the tent stood. She had made it part way, farther than Slobodin, but not as far as Dyatlov. The slope was steep. Climbing in darkness without proper footwear on snow-covered ground would have required enormous effort. Each step would have required conscious will. The body, screaming for rest, for warmth, for cessation of effort, would have fought against every movement. Kolmogorova had kept a diary throughout the expedition. The last entry, written on January 31st at the geologist's hut before the final push, described her excitement about reaching Otorten and her hope that the weather would hold. She wrote about her companions, about how well the group worked together, about her confidence in Dyatlov's leadership. She signed the entry with a small drawing of a smiling face. The diary was found in the tent, along with her camera and her personal belongings. She had not taken it when they fled. The photographs recovered from her camera showed images from the entire expedition, the train journey from Sverdlovsk, the forest camps, her companions laughing and skiing, the mountains emerging from the trees. The final photograph showed the slope where they had pitched the tent, taken in afternoon light on February 1st. The exposure was correct. The composition was competent. It showed nothing unusual, nothing threatening, just a snow-covered mountainside and a grey sky. Rustam Slobodin was found 100 meters below Kolmogorova and 200 meters from the cedar tree. He lay on his back, one arm raised slightly, legs extended. He wore long underwear, a single felt boot and a wool hat pulled down over his ears. His face showed severe frostbite. His lips were pulled back from his teeth in what might have been a grimace or might simply have been the effect of frozen facial muscles. Slobodin's skull showed the small linear fracture noted in the autopsy. A crack on the right side of the head that had not been immediately fatal, but which suggested he had fallen or struck his head during the descent from the tent or during the attempt to return. The injury might have contributed to his death by causing disorientation or loss of balance, making it harder to maintain the effort required to climb the slope, or it might have been incidental, a minor trauma among the greater trauma of dying by cold. The three of them, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Slobodin, had made individual decisions to leave the relative shelter of the forest and attempt to return to the tent. They had not gone together. The spacing of the bodies suggested they had left at different times or had travelled at different speeds. Dyatlov had been the strongest or the most determined, or simply the luckiest in how his body rationed its remaining heat. He had made it farthest, but he had not made it far enough. The question that haunted the investigation was why they had tried at all. By the time they reached the seed of the tree, they must have known how cold they were, how inadequate their clothing was, how rapidly they were losing function. They must have known that returning to the tent meant climbing an exposed slope with no shelter and no guarantee of reaching it before their bodies failed. The rational choice would have been to stay at the cedar tree where there was fire and some protection from wind and the bodies of companions to huddle against for warmth. But perhaps rationality was already compromised. Hypothermia affected judgment. The brain, deprived of adequate oxygen and warmth, made poor decisions. Or perhaps they understood that staying at the cedar meant certain death as the fire died, and decided that any chance, however slim, was better than passive waiting. Or perhaps they had seen something at the cedar, or in the ravine that made staying there seem worse than the climb. The investigator Ivanov interviewed the families of the three. He asked about their personalities, their decision-making patterns, their leadership qualities. The families described Dyatlov as methodical and determined, someone who did not give up easily, who would calculate odds and act on them. They described Kolmogorova as conscientious and loyal, someone who would follow a leader she trusted. They described Slobodin as resilient and pragmatic, someone who had survived near starvation on a previous expedition through sheer stubbornness. These were not people prone to panic or irrational action. These were educated Soviet youth, trained in physical culture and collective problem-solving. They had been selected for the expedition precisely because they could function under stress. And yet they had made what appeared to be a catastrophic error in judgment, leaving the tent without adequate clothing in the first place and then compounding that error by attempting to return across exposed terrain in the final stages of hypothermia. The tent itself was examined repeatedly. Investigators measured it, photographed it from every angle, tested the canvas for any substance that might have caused panic, chemical contamination, smoke residue, anything that might explain why 9 people would slash their way out rather than use the entrance. They found nothing. The tent was a tent. The canvas was canvas. The contents were the normal contents of a winter camping expedition. The slashes in the canvas became objects of particular scrutiny. They had been made with knives. The expedition carried several, standard equipment for cutting rope and preparing food. The cuts were deliberate, not frantic. They showed controlled movement, not panic slashing. Someone had placed a knife against the canvas and drawn it through the fabric with force sufficient to create clean cuts. Multiple cuts had been made, creating openings large enough for a person to crawl through. This suggested that whatever had prompted the exodus had been perceived as urgent but not so overwhelming as to eliminate all motor control. The personal persons cutting the tent had retained enough function to perform a purposeful act. They had not simply torn at the canvas with hands or clawed their way out. They had used tools. They had made escape routes. But escape from what? The tent was intact. The contents were undisturbed. There were no external threats visible in the photographs taken by searchers. No avalanche debris, no damaged equipment, no signs of intrusion. The tent stood as it had been erected, properly secured, properly anchored. If the group had simply abandoned it without slashing it open, one might conclude they had heard or seen something outside that frightened them into flight, but the slashes suggested they felt trapped inside, that leaving through the entrance was either impossible or insufficient. One theory proposed by investigators was that the group had heard or felt the precursor to an avalanche, a deep rumbling, a shift in the snow above them, and had fled preemptively. But examination of the slope showed no evidence of avalanche activity. The snow above the tent was undisturbed. The tent itself had not been struck by moving snow. And avalanches typically left obvious evidence: debris fields, broken trees, disturbed snow patterns. None of these were present. Another theory suggested infrasound, low-frequency sound waves below the range of human hearing that could be generated by wind passing over certain terrain features. Infrasound had been shown in studies to cause feelings of unease, anxiety, and even panic in some individuals. Perhaps a particular configuration of wind and terrain that night had generated infrasound that affected the group's mental state. But this theory was speculative and could not be tested. The wind conditions on February 1st were not unusual for the region. In the end, the investigation could document what had happened, but could not explain why. 9 people had left a tent. 5 had died of hypothermia. 4 had died of hypothermia and trauma. 3 had tried to return to the tent and had died trying. The sequence of events could be reconstructed from physical evidence, but the cause, the unknown compelling force that had initiated the sequence, remained unknown. The files were closed. The case was marked as a resolve to the extent possible given available evidence. The families received the bodies for burial. Memorial services were held in Sverdlovsk. The Institute placed plaques commemorating the expedition members, and the mountain, indifferent to human grief, waited for spring and summer and the return of living things to its slopes, where 9 sets of footprints had long since been erased by wind and fresh snow. Chapter 8. The Inquest. The official investigation concluded on the 28th of May 1959, exactly 4 months after the Dyatlov group had departed from Sverdlovsk on their journey north. The final report, compiled by senior investigator Lev Nikitich Ivanov and submitted to the regional prosecutor's office, ran to more than 300 pages. It contained autopsy reports, witness statements, photographs, maps, meteorological data, and detailed descriptions of the tent, the bodies, and the surrounding terrain. It documented everything that could be documented, and in its conclusion, it offered almost nothing. The relevant passage, translated from the bureaucratic Russian of Soviet legal documents, read as follows. The cause of death of the tourists was freezing in conditions of low temperature. Contributing to the deaths were injuries sustained by some members of the group, the nature and origin of which could not be definitively established. The investigation found no evidence of criminal activity by outside parties. The case is closed due to absence of a guilty party. This language was careful, precise, and deliberately vague. It acknowledged death by hypothermia, an incontrovertible fact supported by autopsy findings. It acknowledged injuries, the rib fractures, the skull fractures, the tissue damage, without attributing them to any specific cause. It stated that no crime had been committed by other humans, which eliminated murder or assault from consideration. And it closed the case not because it had been solved, but because no one could be prosecuted. Ivanov himself was deeply unsatisfied with this conclusion. In the decades that followed, in interviews given after the collapse of the Soviet Union when he was free to speak more openly, he would describe his frustration with the investigation's limits and his conviction that something extraordinary had occurred on the mountain that night. But in May of 1959, bound by the requirements of Soviet legal procedure and the political sensitivities of unexplained deaths, he could do nothing but file his report and move on to other cases. The autopsies remained the most concrete evidence available. Boris Vozrozhdeny, the pathologist, had performed his examinations with professional thoroughness. Each body had been weighed, measured, photographed, and opened. Each organ had been examined. Tissue samples had been taken. The findings had been recorded in detailed reports complete with diagrams showing the location and extent of injuries. For the first 5 bodies, Doroshenko, Krivonishenko, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin, the findings were relatively straightforward. Death by hypothermia, minor injuries consistent with the movement over rough terrain, burns on the hands of the 2 found at the cedar tree, consistent with their attempts to maintain the fire, a small skull fracture in Slobodin that might have resulted from a fall. Nothing that could not be explained by the known facts of their flight from the tent and their exposure to extreme cold. But the 4 bodies recovered from the ravine presented findings that defied easy explanation. Dubinina and Zolotaryov both showed massive chest trauma, multiple rib fractures on the same side, symmetrical patterns suggesting a single powerful force applied to the thorax. Vozrozhdeny had noted in his report that the force required to produce such injuries was comparable to what one might see in high-speed vehicular accidents. He had written in language that would become infamous among those who studied the case in later years that such trauma could not have been caused by another human being, as the force of the blow would have to be extremely high, with no soft tissue damage, no superficial injuries, which is highly unusual. The implication was clear. Whatever had broken their ribs had applied force of extraordinary magnitude without causing external wounds. There were no bruises, no lacerations, no contusions on the skin corresponding to the fractured ribs beneath. The ribs had simply broken, as if the chest cavity had been compressed by some immense pressure. Vozrozhdeny had measured the fractures carefully. Dubinina showed breaks in ribs 2 through 7 on the right side. The fracture lines were clean, not comminuted, meaning the bones had broken in single places rather than shattering into multiple fragments. This pattern was more consistent with a single overwhelming force than with repeated blows. If someone had beaten her with a club or kicked her repeatedly, the pattern would be different, more scattered, more varied in severity, with corresponding soft tissue damage. Zolotaryov's injuries were similar. Ribs 2 through 6 on the right side, clean fractures, no external wounds. Additionally, both Dubinina and Zolotaryov showed hemorrhage edging in the cardiac muscle, suggesting the heart had been subjected to trauma. This was not unusual in cases of chest trauma, but it indicated the force had been sufficient to affect the heart's tissue through the intact rib cage before the ribs broke. Thibaut Brignol's skull fracture was equally puzzling. The fracture was extensive, a depressed fracture of the temporal bone that had driven fragments into the brain. Such an injury would typically be accompanied by significant scalp damage, bruising, laceration, swelling, but Thibaut Brignol's scalp showed minimal damage. The skull had fractured, but the overlying tissue had not. This suggested the injury had occurred either very close to the time of death, when blood pressure was dropping and bruising would not develop normally, or through some mechanism that applied force directly to the bone without affecting the soft tissue. The investigator Ivanov had consulted with additional medical experts, seeking explanations. One suggested that the bodies might have been crushed by the weight of accumulated snow in the ravine. 4 meters of snow represented significant mass. If it had compacted suddenly, or if the bodies had been trapped in a position where the snow's weight concentrated on their chests, it might explain the rib fractures. But this theory had problems. Snow typically distributed its weight evenly. It compressed gradually as more snow accumulated on top. It did not suddenly apply concentrated force to specific areas of the body. And if snow weight had caused the injuries, one would expect to see fractures in multiple areas: arms, legs, pelvis, not just the chest. Moreover, the bodies had been found lying on a platform of cut branches, which would have provided some protection and distribution of weight. Another expert suggested the injuries might have resulted from a fall into the ravine. Perhaps the four had been walking along the ravine's edge in darkness and had fallen the 4 meters to the bottom, landing on rocks or ice. This might explain Thibaut Brignol's skull fracture, but it did not explain why there were no fractures of the arms or legs, no typical defensive injuries, no external wounds corresponding to impact. People who fell onto rocks broke limbs. They scraped skin. They bled. The four in the ravine showed none of these patterns. A third theory, one that Ivanov himself eventually came to favor though he could not include it in his official report, involved military testing. The Ural region was home to numerous Soviet military installations. Rocket tests were conducted. New weapon systems were developed. Perhaps the Dyatlov group had inadvertently camped in or near a test zone. Perhaps they had witnessed something they were not supposed to see. Perhaps the injuries had resulted from exposure to some kind of weapon, a shockwave weapon, a pressure device, something that could cause internal trauma without external wounds. This theory had the advantage of explaining the otherwise inexplicable injuries. It also explained the elevated radiation levels found on some clothing items during testing, not high enough to be dangerous, but higher than background, possibly from contamination by radioactive materials used in certain weapon systems. And it explained why the case might have been closed quickly, with vague language about unknown compelling forces. If military involvement was suspected, the investigation would be shut down by authorities higher than a regional prosecutor. But Ivanov had no evidence of military activity in the area on February 1st. He had inquired discreetly and been told no tests were scheduled near Kholat Shakal. He had no witnesses who had seen unusual lights or heard explosions, except for reports from another hiking group more than 50 kilometers away who claimed to have seen strange orange spheres in the sky on the night of February 1st. These reports were noted in the investigation file but were considered unreliable. Distant observers, darkness, possible misidentification of natural phenomena. The radiation testing itself was inconclusive. Samples of clothing from several bodies were sent to a radiological laboratory in Sverdlovsk. The tests showed elevated beta radiation on some items, particularly on a brown sweater worn by Kolevatov and on pieces of Dubinina's clothing. The levels were measured at between 2 and 5 times normal background radiation. This was noteworthy but not necessarily significant. Krivonishenko worked at a nuclear facility and could have contaminated his clothing through occupational exposure. natural radiation from certain minerals in the soil could produce similar readings, and the testing methods in 1959 were less precise than those developed in later decades. The investigator included the radiation findings in his report but drew no conclusions from them. He noted that the levels detected were not sufficient to cause radiation sickness or contribute to death. He noted that contamination could have occurred through various means unrelated to the deaths. He noted the findings and moved on. The question of the missing tongue and soft tissue from Dubinina's mouth received similar treatment. Bezrozhdeny had noted the tissue loss in his autopsy report. The tongue, the floor of the mouth, and portions of the upper throat were absent. The pathologist suggested this could be consistent with decomposition, particularly if the body had been exposed to flowing water before being completely frozen and buried. The ravine would have collected snowmelt. Water would have flowed over and around the bodies before the deep winter cold froze everything solid. But Dubinina's body had been frozen for 3 months. Decomposition typically ceased at freezing temperatures. The amount of tissue loss seemed excessive for the conditions, and while animals or birds might have scavenged soft tissue, the body had been buried beneath 4 meters of snow, making it inaccessible to most scavengers. The tissue loss remained unexplained, listed in the autopsy report as a finding without interpretation. In the end, Ivanov's report contained facts without narrative. It documented what had been found but could not explain why or how. The bodies were here. The injuries were these. The sequence of events appeared to be thus, but the cause, the initial event that had set everything in motion, remained beyond the reach of evidence. The families of the dead were not satisfied. They pressed for additional investigation. They demanded answers. Some believed their children had been killed by the hostile Mansi tribesmen, though there was no evidence of Mansi presence in the area, and the Mansi who were interviewed stated that the dead mountain was avoided even by them. It was not a place for hunting or herding, that no one went there in winter. Others believed the group had encountered criminals or escaped prisoners, though no such individuals were known to be in the region, and the remoteness of the location made this unlikely. Still others believed Soviet authorities were concealing military involvement, and this belief would persist for decades. The case was officially closed on May the 28th. The investigation files were sealed and stored in regional archives. Access was restricted. The families were told that no further investigation was possible or warranted. The deaths were tragic but resulted from natural causes, exposure to extreme cold following an incident whose nature could not be determined. 3 years later, in 1962, the restriction on expeditions to the area was quietly lifted. Hikers and mountaineers could again travel through the region. But few did. The mountain had acquired a reputation. Stories circulated about the unexplained deaths, about the strange injuries, about lights in the sky and military cover-ups. The mountain that the Mansi called Dead Mountain had lived up to its name, and most who knew the story preferred to seek their achievements elsewhere. Decades would pass, the Soviet Union would collapse, archives would open, documents would be declassified. And the Dyatlov case would emerge from obscurity to become one of the most analysed and debated mysteries in the history of unexplained deaths. Thousands of pages would be written. Dozens of theories would be proposed. Investigators, both professional and amateur, would journey to the mountain to examine the site. But the mountain kept its secrets. The snow that fell in February of 1959 had long since melted and returned and melted again, and the 9 who died there remained silent, their testimony buried with them in the frozen earth where they were laid to rest. Chapter 9. The silence descends. The funerals were held in Sverdlovsk over several days in March and May of 1959 as the bodies were released by the medical examiner and returned to their families. The city's public cemetery received the dead, young men and women who had left on a winter expedition with songs and confidence, and who returned in sealed coffins with death certificates that listed hypothermia as cause and nothing else. The first funeral was for Igor Dyatlov. He was buried on the 9th of March, 1 week after his body had been recovered from the slope. Hundreds attended, fellow students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, family members, friends, members of the hiking clubs where he had led previous expeditions. The ceremony was conducted according to Soviet secular tradition. There were no priests. There were speeches about his dedication to physical culture, his leadership, his service to Soviet sport. There was a moment of silence. His photograph, showing him in winter gear with a slight smile, was placed at the head of the grave, and then the earth received him. Zinaida Kolmogorova was buried the same day. Her parents stood at the graveside weeping. Her younger brother, to whom she had promised a stone from Mount Torton, stood pale and silent. The speeches said she had been a devoted student, a loyal friend. A bright future extinguished too soon. They said nothing about the blood around her mouth when she was found, or the fact that she had died crawling through snow toward a shelter she would never reach. Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko were buried on the 10th of March. Rustam Slobodin followed on the 12th. For each, the pattern was the same. Grief expressed within the boundaries permitted by Soviet public mourning, speeches that praised the dead without questioning the circumstances of death, burials that closed graves but not the questions the families carried. The four recovered in May, Dubinina, Kolevatov, Thibaut Brignol and Zolotaryov, were buried later, after their autopsies had been completed and after the investigator had finished his examination of their clothing and effects. Dubinina's mother requested an open casket, wanting to see her daughter one final time. The request was denied. The undertaker explained that the condition of the body after 3 months in the ravine made this impossible, though he did not elaborate on the missing tongue, or the broken ribs, or the state of decomposition that had occurred, despite the freezing cold. Semyon Zolotaryov, the eldest of the group and the last to join the expedition, was buried in a section of the cemetery reserved for war veterans. He had survived the siege of Stalingrad. He had marched into Germany with the Red Army. He had carried shrapnel in his spine from a wound sustained in battle. He had survived all of that only to die at 37 on a mountainside in the Urals for reasons no one could explain. His grave marker listed his birth year and death year and nothing else. The families were not permitted to speak publicly about their doubts. Soviet society in 1959 did not welcome questions about official conclusions. The state had investigated. The state had determined the cause of death. The state had closed the case. To continue pressing for answers was to suggest the state's investigation had been inadequate or dishonest, and such suggestions invited unwelcome attention from authorities who had little patience for citizens who questioned official narratives. Some families accepted this. Others did not. In private, they shared information. They compared notes about what they had been told. They discussed the inconsistencies, the slashed tent, the missing clothing, the unexplained injuries, the radiation traces. They wondered if their children had stumbled into something forbidden, had witnessed something they should not have seen, had been silenced. But wondering was all they could do. The files were sealed. The investigation was closed. And the mountain, 400 kilometers north, waited in silence. The Ural Polytechnic Institute erected a memorial plaque listing the names of the 9 dead. It was placed in a common area where students passed daily. The plaque described them as having died in the northern Urals during a winter expedition. It made no mention of the circumstances. Students who had known them paused at the plaque and remembered. New students, arriving in subsequent years, walked past it without knowing the story behind the names. The sports club that had approved Dyatlov's expedition conducted an internal review of its procedures for authorizing winter routes. New requirements were established. Expeditions graded Category 3 or higher would require additional oversight. Groups would be required to file more detailed route plans. Return dates would be enforced more strictly. The changes were implemented quietly, without public announcement, without acknowledgement that previous procedures had been inadequate. The club's administrators did not want to suggest they bore any responsibility for what had happened. They wanted only to ensure it did not happen again. In the years immediately following the incident, other hiking groups reported unease when travelling in the northern Urals. Some claimed to have seen lights in the sky, orange spheres or strange glowing formations that moved in ways inconsistent with aircraft or natural phenomena. Others reported sounds, low rumbling or high-pitched humming that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. These reports were dismissed by authorities as imagination or misidentification of natural phenomena. But they persisted. The Mansi people, the indigenous inhabitants of the Ural region who had herded reindeer across the highlands for centuries, had their own explanations. The mountain called Kholat Shakal had been avoided long before the Dyatlov incident. The name itself, Dead Mountain or Bald Mountain, reflected generations of experience. The Mansi did not graze their herds there, they did not camp there, they did not travel there unless necessity demanded. When asked why, they offered answers rooted in tradition rather than explanation. The mountain was not a good place. The spirits there were old and cold. The wind carried voices. The snow did not fall naturally but was thrown. Better to go elsewhere. These explanations were recorded by ethnographers interested in indigenous folklore but were not taken seriously by Soviet authorities. The Soviet state did not officially recognize spirits or supernatural explanations for natural events. Mountains were geological formations, wind was atmospheric movement. Death in winter conditions was a matter of physics and biology, not malevolent forces or ancient curses. The Mansi beliefs were catalogued as cultural artifacts and dismissed as superstition. The restriction placed on expeditions to the region in the immediate aftermath of the incident was officially described as a safety measure. The area had proven dangerous. 9 experienced hikers had died. Until the causes could be better understood and safety protocols improved, the region would be closed to recreational travel. This explanation was plausible and was generally accepted by the hiking community. Few questioned it. Fewer still protested. The Urals offered thousands of other peaks and valleys for exploration. One mountain more or less made little difference. But among those who studied the case closely, the families, the investigator Ivanov, certain members of the search parties, there was a growing sense that the restriction served another purpose. If military testing had been involved, if the group had witnessed something classified, if the injuries had resulted from something the state did not want publicized, then closing the area prevented others from stumbling onto similar evidence or experiencing similar incidents. The restriction was a perimeter, a boundary, a line that said this place is not for you. The restriction remained in effect until 1962. Then, without explanation, it was lifted. No announcement was made, no official statement was issued. The area simply appeared once more on approved route maps for winter expeditions. A few brave or curious groups travelled there, climbed the surrounding peaks, skied across the plateau. They found nothing unusual. The mountain was simply a mountain, the forest was simply forest. The snow fell and melted according to season, indifferent to human tragedy. Investigator Ivanov continued to work cases in the Sverdlovsk region for years after closing the Dyatlov file. He investigated deaths, accidents, crimes. He built a career in Soviet law enforcement. But the Dyatlov case remained with him unresolved and troubling. In private conversations with colleagues, he expressed his conviction that the official conclusion was incomplete. He believed something had occurred on the mountain that night that fell outside normal categories of explanation. But he had no evidence to support this belief beyond his own sense that the pattern of injuries and the circumstances of death did not fit any standard model. In 1990, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ivanov gave an interview to a journalist. He was retired by then, an old man looking back on a long career. He spoke about various cases, various investigations, and when asked about Dyatlov, he said that he believed the group had encountered something beyond his ability to explain using the tools available to a regional investigator in 1959. He mentioned the reports of lights in the sky. He mentioned the strange injuries. He mentioned his belief that military involvement was possible, perhaps even likely. And then he said that he had been ordered to close the case, that pressure had come from above, that certain avenues of investigation had been quietly blocked. The journalist pressed for details. Ivanov provided none. He said only that some things could not be known, that some files would remain sealed, that some questions would persist beyond the lifetimes of those who asked them. He died in 2001, taking whatever additional knowledge he possessed to his grave. The pathologist Vozrojdeny also maintained silence for decades. His autopsy reports were thorough and professional. They documented findings without speculation. He performed the examinations assigned to him and filed the required paperwork. But in later years, when asked about the case by researchers, he acknowledged that the injuries to the four found in the ravine remained unexplained in his professional opinion. He had seen many bodies in his career: accident victims, murder victims, victims of industrial disasters and natural deaths, but he had never seen injuries quite like those found on Dubinina and Zolotaryov. Massive internal trauma with minimal external evidence. He could describe them. He could not explain them. The files themselves remained sealed in regional archives for decades. Access was restricted to official personnel. Families could request information but received only limited documents: death certificates, release forms, sanitized summaries. The full investigation file, with its photographs and interviews and detailed reports, remained unavailable. This was standard procedure for closed criminal investigations in the Soviet system, but it fueled speculation that information was being deliberately withheld. In the 1980s and 1990s, as Soviet control loosened and then collapsed, portions of the file began to leak. Journalists obtained copies of documents, researchers gained access to archives. The photographs taken by the Dyatlov group and by the search parties were published. The autopsy reports were circulated, and with each new piece of information, the mystery deepened rather than resolved. The mountain itself remained indifferent to all of this. Winter came and went. Snow fell and melted. The forest grew and shed its needles and grew again. The slope where the tent had stood showed no permanent mark. The cedar tree where two had died eventually fell, toppled by wind or rot, and became part of the forest floor. The ravine where four had lain buried continued to collect snow each winter and to flow with meltwater each spring. And time, which erased footprints and scattered bones and weathered stone, continued its work without pause or mercy. Chapter 10. The Mountain Remembers. 66 years have passed since 9 people climbed a slope in the northern Urals and never descended alive. 66 winters have buried the mountain in snow. 66 springs have melted that snow and sent it flowing down ravines into rivers that carry no memory of what they touch. The forest has grown and died and grown again. The rocks have shifted infinitesimally under the weight of ice and the pressure of roots. And the mountain called Kholat Shakhl, Dead Mountain, remains. The case has never truly closed. The official investigation ended in May of 1959 with vague conclusions and sealed files, but the questions persisted. Families asked them until age and death silenced their voices. Researchers asked them, travelling to the mountain, examining the site, measuring distances, taking photographs that were compared against photographs taken in 1959 to determine what had changed and what remained. Journalists asked them, writing articles and books, conducting interviews, proposing the theories, and the internet, when it came, allowed the questions to spread beyond Russia, beyond the Soviet Union's borders, into a global conversation about unexplained death and the limits of rational explanation. The theories multiplied with the passage of time. Each new generation of investigators brought new tools, new methodologies, new frameworks for understanding what had occurred. The theories range from the plausible to the absurd, from the mundane to the fantastic, and none provided answers that satisfied all the evidence. The avalanche theory was among the first and most persistent. Avalanches killed mountaineers regularly. The Dyatlov group had camped on a slope. Perhaps a slab avalanche, a layer of snow breaking loose and sliding down the mountain, had struck the tent during the night. This would explain the sudden flight. The group would have had seconds to escape before being buried. They would have cut through the tent's side because the entrance might have been blocked by accumulating snow. Once outside, they would have fled downslope to escape the avalanche path. But the evidence contradicted this theory. The tent was found intact, properly erected, with contents undisturbed. An avalanche would have collapsed the tent, torn it from its moorings, scattered or buried the contents. The slope above the tent showed no signs of snow movement, no fracture lines, no debris field, no stripped vegetation. And the injuries to those found in the ravine, while severe, were not distributed in the pattern typical of avalanche victims, who usually showed crush injuries across multiple body regions and suffocation from snow inhalation. A modified avalanche theory proposed in 2021 by researchers using computer modelling suggested that a small delayed slab avalanche might have struck the tent hours after it was pitched, causing injury to some occupants and prompting the flight. The injuries sustained during this initial impact would explain the rib fractures found later. But this theory still struggled with the lack of avalanche evidence at the site and the fact that the tent was found standing rather than buried or destroyed. The military testing theory gained adherents, especially after the Soviet Union's collapse, allowed more open discussion of classified programs. The Ural region had been home to nuclear facilities, rocket testing ranges, and various classified military projects. Perhaps the Dyatlov group had camped in or near a test zone. Perhaps they had been exposed to a weapons test, a shockwave weapon, a thermobaric device, something that produced the severe internal injuries without corresponding external wounds. Perhaps they had witnessed something classified and had been seriously staggered, with the scene staged to appear as death by exposure. This theory explained the unusual injuries and the radiation traces found on some clothing. It explained why the investigation had been closed quickly with vague language. It explained why certain files remained sealed even after the Soviet collapse. But it provided no direct evidence. No witnesses placed military personnel in the area. No documents confirmed testing on February 1st. And the logistical difficulty of staging such a scene, moving bodies, arranging clothing, creating the appearance of fire at the cedar tree, while possible, seemed unnecessarily elaborate if the goal was simply to eliminate witnesses. The infrasound theory proposed that wind passing over the mountain's contours generated low-frequency sound waves below the range of human hearing. Studies had shown that infrasound could cause feelings of anxiety, dread, and panic in some individuals. Perhaps the combination of wind conditions and terrain that night produced infrasound that affected the group's mental state, causing irrational fear that prompted their flight from the tent. Once outside and exposed to the cold, they succumbed to hypothermia, and the injuries occurred through falls or other accidents in the darkness. This theory had the advantage of explaining seemingly irrational behavior through a natural mechanism, but it required specific wind conditions that could not be verified 66 years after the fact. It did not explain why all 9 members would be equally affected to the point of fleeing simultaneously, and it did not explain the severe injuries to those found in the ravine, which seemed inconsistent with simple falls. Theories involving indigenous Mansi people attacking the group were quickly dismissed by serious investigators. The Mansi were peaceful reindeer herders with no history of violence toward Russian travelers. The evidence showed no signs of external attack, no weapon marks, no defensive wounds, no tracks other than those of the 9 victims. And the Mansi themselves avoided the mountain, considering it a place of ill fortune. They had no reason to defend it violently and every reason to simply stay away. Psychological theories proposed various forms of group panic or shared delusion. Perhaps someone in the tent experienced a psychological break and convinced others that immediate flight was necessary. Perhaps carbon monoxide from the stove caused confusion, though this did not explain why they had retained enough function to walk in an organized manner down the slope and to build a fire at the cedar tree. Perhaps paradoxical undressing, the phenomenon where hypothermia victims feel overwhelmingly hot and remove clothing, had begun inside the tent, prompting confusion that led to the exodus. But the evidence of the slashed tent argued against simple panic or confusion. The cuts were deliberate, purposeful, made with the tools, and the group had moved together down the slope, suggesting some maintained leadership and cohesion, rather than scattering and individual panic. More exotic theories emerged over the decades. encounters with indigenous cryptids reported in regional folklore, exposure to naturally occurring but poorly understood atmospheric phenomena, even suggestions of extraterrestrial involvement based on the reports of lights in the sky from distant observers. These theories proliferated in sensationalist media and on internet forums, but found little support among serious researchers who prioritized evidence over speculation. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the case in response to petitions from families and public interest. A new investigation was conducted using modern forensic techniques. The lead investigator, after reviewing evidence and visiting the site, concluded that the deaths had resulted from an avalanche, though he acknowledged that this conclusion was based on probability and modelling rather than physical evidence of avalanche activity at the scene. The families were again unsatisfied. The evidence that had troubled them for 6 decades still troubled them. The slashed tent, the unexplained injuries, the organised nature of the flight, the missing soft tissue from Dubinina's mouth, the radiation traces, the rapid closure of the original investigation, the sealed files, the official conclusions that explain nothing while claiming to explain everything. The mountain itself provided no answers to those who visited it. Expeditions travelled there regularly now. Hikers climbed to the site where the tent had stood. They photographed the view. They stood in the wind and tried to imagine what it had been like on that February night in 1959. Some reported feeling unease, a sense of wrongness, though this might simply have been the knowledge of what had happened colouring their perception. The mountain was cold and exposed and inhospitable in winter, as mountains in the northern Urals typically were. Nothing distinguished it from dozens of similar peaks except the history it carried and the name it had acquired. A memorial plaque was eventually placed at the site listing the names of the 9 dead. Visitors left small tokens, flowers in summer, candles, notes, photographs. The plaque weathered in the wind and was replaced periodically as rust and ice damage made it illegible. And still the mountain remained, indifferent to human memory, patient in its silence. The photographs taken by the Dyatlov group during their expedition have been analysed endlessly. The final images, recovered from cameras found in the tent, show ordinary scenes: friends skiing, camps being established, mountains rising from forest. The last photograph shows the tent being prepared on the slope in afternoon light on February 1st. The exposure is correct, the composition is normal. There is nothing visible in the frame that suggests danger or abnormality. Just a tent, just a slope, just a grey winter sky over the northern Urals. But somewhere between that photograph and dawn on February 2nd, something happened. Something that 9 experienced winter campers perceived as threatening enough to slash their way out of a tent and flee into cold that would kill them. Something that left no tracks, no physical evidence, no marks except on the bodies themselves. Something that, in 66 years of investigation and speculation and analysis, has never been definitively identified. The rational mind demands rational explanations. Death should have causes that can be determined, documented, understood. Events should follow from prior events in chains of causation that can be traced. Mystery should yield to investigation. But sometimes the evidence does not form a coherent narrative. Sometimes the pieces do not fit. Sometimes the mountain keeps its secrets despite all efforts to extract them. The 9 who died are buried in Sverdlovsk, now called again Yekaterinburg after the Soviet Union's fall. Their graves are tended, their names are remembered. Organizations dedicated to preserving the memory of the incident maintain records and conduct research. Annual commemorations mark the anniversary of the expedition's departure. And slowly, as the years accumulate, the living witnesses, the families, the search party members, the investigators, pass beyond the reach of questions, taking with them whatever fragments of understanding they might have possessed. The mountain remains, winter comes, snow falls, wind howls across empty slopes, and in the silence between one season and the next, in the space where explanation fails and mystery endures, the past continues to whisper its unanswered questions to anyone who will listen. The candle has burned low, the chamber has fallen silent, and history once again turns the page in the dark,